So with the two parts of The Stranger, you have them divided up into the first part, leading up to Meursault killing the Arab on the beach, and the second part after he kills him. In the first part, we notice that Meursault, while he may not have reasons for everything he does, has at least the freedom to act on his impulses. If he wants to go to the beach after his mother's funeral, he does so. If he wants to sit on a chair and look out the window all day the day after, he can do so. In part 2, Meursault doesn't quite have that freedom. Instead of being able to do whatever he likes, he's more restricted. He is, in chapter 1, we see, shuffled between the jail and the courtroom or courthouse where he speaks to both the lawyer and the examining magistrate. And in chapter 2, we see him in his prison cell for the long term. Although Meursault is now in a more serious situation, he doesn't treat things quite as seriously as others would expect him to, or would want him to. And this may be an instance in something that may seem familiar to you by now, as an instance of him acting like a stranger, him being strange or different or odd, and that being why he upsets so many people. He talks about the lawyer being annoyed with him because he doesn't seem like everyone else, and having the urge, Meursault feeling the urge, to reassure him that he is like everybody else. The judge, the magistrate, in examining him, tells him that he believes that all men believe in God, and that if he denies this, then his own life would be robbed of meaning. And he asks Meursault if he wants to rob him of his life's meaning. Now, this understanding of the title, The Stranger, the outsider, applying to Meursault in this way that he's a stranger or an outsider because he doesn't conform to society or play by the rules. He doesn't accept the same things that they do, whether it be religion or morality or just simply the acceptance that there is meaning and intention, is a famous interpretation that goes especially back to Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote an essay called The Explication of the Stranger, or kind of a book review, shortly after its publication, which really brought the book and the author to a prominence it hadn't had prior to that. It's interesting to note, too, that both the book, The Stranger, and this book review were published in Nazi-occupied Paris, and Sartre and Camus were both involved in the underground literary resistance, in which case you had both a bunch of literal strangers or foreigners occupying the city and establishing a new kind of society and social rules and expectations which they themselves were against. Now, these were published above ground, so they couldn't explicitly make them anti-Nazi stories, but perhaps their deeper meanings may have been influenced by that as well. Something to keep in mind and perhaps explore if you're interested in that. Nonetheless, in his Explication of the Stranger, Sartre wrote, quote, "And now we fully understand the title of Camus' novel. The stranger he wants to portray is precisely one of those terrible innocents who shock society by not accepting the rules of its game. He lives among outsiders, but to them, too, he is a stranger. That is why some people like him, for example his mistress Marie, who is fond of him because he's odd. Others, like the courtroom crowd whose hatred he suddenly feels mounting towards him, hate him for the same reason. And we ourselves, who on opening the book are not yet familiar with the feeling of the absurd, vainly try to judge him according to our usual standards. For us, too, he is a stranger." Sartre also points out that The Stranger is not an explanatory book, and the absurd man does not explain, he describes. That goes in line with Camus writing in his non-fiction treatise, The Myth of Sisyphus, that, quote, "The fact that certain great novelists have chosen to write in terms of images rather than of arguments reveals a great deal about a certain kind of thinking common to them all, a conviction of the futility of all explanatory principles, and of the instructive message of sensory impressions." Now, while this was something that Camus tried to convey in his book, it's also something that his character, Meursault, also seems to use as a kind of mode of operation. He doesn't even understand or explain his own thoughts or actions a lot of the time. He simply relates what he feels, either sensory impressions from external sources, the sun, or the sight of light in the funeral home, things like that, or how they impact him. It feels like daggers in his eyes, it feels painful, or he feels sleepy or drowsy, things like that, as opposed to explaining why these things happen. And within the book, that becomes a problem for other people, that they can't explain these things. And part of the absurdity of Camus, or the absurdism of him, is that he thinks that while every human has, it seems, an urge or desire to create and find meaning by explaining things, by giving reasons, by pointing to causes, there really is no connection. So even in organizing the book into two parts, in chapters within each part, Camus does impart a certain order to his story. And between parts 1 and part 2, we ourselves can infer or try to explain the connection between the two parts, and we can easily say, well, it's part 2 and part 1 because they're divided by this murder that's a kind of central point of the book, and that's what's important and that's what it hinges on, just as the book hinges upon it. And yet at the same time, Camus, with his story and his character, as well as his explanations and Sartre's explanations and interpretations, seems to want to say that this order is all imposed and it's not really there. We experience things, all these moments, one after the other, and while we want to impose an order to explain them and understand them, there really is no inherent order in them. It's all merely imposed or constructed. Or as Sartre puts it in his essay, quote, "We have on the one hand the amorphous everyday flow of reality as it is experienced, and on the other, the edifying reconstruction of this reality by speech and human reason. The reader, brought face to face with simple reality, must find it again, without being able to recognize it in its rational transposition. This is the source of the feeling of the absurd, that is, of our inability to think, with our words and concepts, what happens in the world. Meursault buries his mother, takes a mistress, and commits a crime." Now, while this interpretation is a very popular and famous one, especially because it goes back to the author and is very early, it may not be exhaustive. It may not be the only way to interpret the novel or the only things that are in it. As even Camus admits or claims, and Sartre picks up on, the novel is not explanatory. It is one that presents an image. So I think with most classes, with the exception of Block 5, I posed the question, is this novel just to teach you about existential philosophy, or does it do more than that? Does it tell a story that is interesting in other ways? And I think a lot of us thought that it does more than just try to explain existentialist philosophy. So with that in mind, I think there's a few things worth picking up on that may not be covered in the summary videos you've seen so far, or the popular ones out there, whether they be academic like the Course Hero ones, or kind of edutainment like Thug Notes version. And those are just a few motifs that I'd like to go through and show some quotes for. You'll see them in chapters 1 and 2 here, and you may have noticed them, or you might think back and find them in other places in the novel as well. So another way that we might be able to interpret the title The Stranger, the outsider, the foreigner, is in light of another recurring thing or motif throughout the novel, and that is the Arabs, or the Moors, the native Arab and Moorish population of Algeria who show up throughout the novel, including at, of course, the center point where Meursault kills an Arab on the beach, and we never really hear their names, we never really have dialogue from them, but they're mentioned as existing and interacting with characters in a kind of sometimes background capacity. So for example, in chapter 2, when Meursault talks about first going to jail, he says, quote, "The day of my arrest I was first put in a room where there were already several other prisoners, most of them Arabs. They laughed when they saw me. Then they asked me what I was in for. I said I'd killed an Arab, and they were all silent. A few minutes later it got dark. They showed me how to fix the mat I was supposed to sleep on." Also, when Meursault has a visit from Marie, he and other prisoners go, and their visitors are lined up on the other side of two sets of bars with about 8 feet or something like that between them. Now, while Meursault notices that with that distance you would have to shout, he notices something interesting about most of the Arab prisoners. So he says, quote, "Most of the Arab prisoners and their families had squatted down facing each other. They weren't shouting. Despite the commotion, they were managing to make themselves heard by talking in very low voices. Their subdued murmuring, coming from lower down, formed a kind of bass accompaniment to the conversations crossing above their heads." Now, just as someone might be a stranger to society because they don't conform by the rules, they don't play the game, and they don't do things the same way, we also have the question of, well, who is the foreigner here? Is Meursault more of a foreigner because he may or may not be native-born, but certainly he is unlike, apparently, the Arabs, and even pits himself against them in some way. He comes in and says, well, what is he in for? He killed an Arab, and he is not himself an Arab. You can also ask, well, is someone a stranger because they don't know how to get along with depending where they are, or not? Here you have the Arabs seem to be more comfortable with understanding how to perform, how to do things in the place where they are, as opposed to the French prisoners, or pied noir prisoners, who have to speak over the conversation and have trouble and difficulty doing so efficiently. They end up taking turns or shouting over each other or interrupting each other to the point where Meursault at some point can't hear Marie's answers to his questions or his comments, or he is not able to make one clearly across to her. Something else that's worth looking at in these two chapters, and something which is related conceptually to something we talked about, is the idea of a game. So we can talk about adhering to social norms and mores as playing the game. We have two mentions in chapters 1 and chapter 2, one in each, of games that Meursault seems to refer to. In chapter 1, when he's first talking to the lawyer, he says, quote, "At first I didn't take him seriously. I was led into a curtained room. There was a single lamp on his desk which was shining on a chair where he had me sit while he remained standing in the shadows. I had read descriptions of scenes like this in books, and it all seemed like a game to me." Yet, in chapter 2, Meursault reads a story on a newspaper clipping about a man who went to seek his fortune and tried to play a game, trick his mother and sister, who did not recognize him after 25 years, into thinking him just a simple rich guest at their hotel. And in the night, without knowing his identity, the mother and sister kill him to steal his money. The next day, his wife and child come, explain the joke, explain the deception, and out of grief and guilt, the mother and sister both kill themselves. Meursault, after reading the story or talking about it, says, quote, "Anyway, I thought the traveler pretty much deserved what he got, and that you should never play games." So perhaps we have here a development or change in Meursault's understanding of games. At once he thought that it was simply like a game that he was playing, when really this serious and grave situation, which does lead to death, or end in death, is not something which should be taken lightly and played like a game. Now, the last major motif, or really theme, that I think shows up through the book a lot, and which is worth commenting on, but I have not seen it commented on in any videos so far, is that of habituation or habitude, French l'habitude, habituation, being in the habit, you could say. It's something which shows up throughout the book, and multiple times in just these two chapters, but really from the very beginning. For instance, in chapter 1, the magistrate is trying to understand why Meursault did what he did, and what he thinks and feels, and understand his motivations. And Meursault says, quote, "Nevertheless, I answered that it had pretty much lost the habit of analyzing myself, and that it was hard for me to tell him what he wanted to know. I probably did love Mamma, but that didn't mean anything. At one time or another, all normal people have wished their loved ones were dead." Later, when Meursault shows no remorse or no religious belief to the magistrate responds or tells him, in a low voice, quote, "I have never seen a soul as hardened as yours. The criminals who have come before me have always wept at the sight of this image of suffering." And Meursault thinks in response, "I was about to say that was precisely because they were criminals. But then I realized that I was one too. It was an idea I couldn't get used to." Later in chapter 2, in his prison cell, Meursault reflects, "At the time, I often thought that if I had had to live in the trunk of a dead tree, with nothing to do but look up at the sky flowering overhead, little by little I would have gotten used to it. Now, as I think back on it, I wasn't in a hollow tree trunk. There were others worse off than me. Anyway, it was one of Maman's ideas, and she often repeated it, that after a while you could get used to anything." Recall that in chapter 1, Maman was also someone who cried until she got used to it. Lastly, in reflecting on the punitive aspect of his imprisonment, Meursault says, "I couldn't understand why they had taken my cigarettes away, when they didn't hurt anybody. Later on, I realized that too was part of the punishment, but by then I had gotten used to not smoking, and it wasn't a punishment anymore." Now, particularly important to Camus' absurdism and Sartre's existentialism and a number of other existentialist philosophies is that whether human actions have value or meaning or not, human beings do have free will. They have the power to choose. And that the responsibility of that power to choose and the consequences of their actions are something which every human being, every person, should take full responsibility for and be aware of. Now, it's easy to lose track of one's ability to choose and the responsibility for choice, but you see it all the time. For instance, with Meursault's lawyer, he tries to get Meursault to talk about how he felt in response to his mother's death. He asks him if he was sad, expecting that, like most people, he would be sad. Meursault is resistant to that point, but the idea being, behind the lawyer's thinking, that if Meursault could say that he was sad, that he was in grief, perhaps even inconsolable, that would have affected his ability to choose a few days later on the beach to shoot the Arab or not. It doesn't make sense, but perhaps this could both give it an explanation as well as remove some of his culpability from his choice and decision to pull the trigger and kill a man. At points, Meursault goes against this routine or habit of simply going with the flow, and at times he does give into it. For instance, when talking to the lawyer, he says, "Mostly I could tell I made him uncomfortable. He didn't understand me, and he was sort of holding it against me. I felt the urge to reassure him that I was like everybody else, just like everybody else. But there really wasn't much point, and I gave up the idea out of laziness." So whether it's out of laziness that he gives up his choice, or because of it that he makes his choice, or because he rationally doesn't see a point to convincing the lawyer to like him, Meursault is making a choice in how he interacts with the lawyer. In Meursault's interaction with the magistrate, he also exhibits both a willingness to go along with what others expect of him and a reluctance and resistance to. After explaining to Meursault about God and forgiveness and repentance, Meursault says, "I was struck by how sincere he seemed, but I had had enough. It was getting hotter and hotter. As always, whenever I want to get rid of someone I'm not really listening to, I made it appear as if I agreed. To my surprise, he acted triumphant. 'You see,' he said. 'You do believe, don't you? And you're going to place your trust in him, aren't you?' Obviously, again I said no. He fell back in his chair." So while Meursault seems, again, to be somewhat fine with going along with making other people like him, with doing what they expect and want of him, he is also reluctant to do so, and is fine with making a choice at one moment to follow his senses to whatever will give him relief, and at the next moment to simply say what he truly has on his mind, which is to respond that no, he doesn't believe, or he won't repent, or both. Now, a last couple criticisms you could do outside the line of the traditional existentialist understanding could be both psychological and moral. For instance, in Jean-Paul Sartre's essay, The Explication of the Stranger, he says, "Since God does not exist and man dies, everything is permissible. One experience is as good as another. The important thing is simply to acquire as many as possible." Now, while the first part does go in line with Sartre's and Camus' atheistic existentialism, the second part doesn't follow from the first as far as valuing experiences and the important thing being to acquire as many as possible. That's simply an additional assertion which doesn't follow from this first premise that God does not exist and man dies and everything being permissible, which does more or less align with each other. This is actually related to the classic argument about a relationship between God and morality, which can be stated simply with a syllogism: if objective moral obligations exist, then there exists a God to explain them. Objective moral obligations do exist, therefore God exists. Now, what Camus and Sartre and other atheistic existentialist philosophers do, as well as a number of non-existentialist philosophers may also make the same claim, is they deny that moral obligations are objective. They will say they're subjective, they're merely constructed, and so by denying that, they don't need to account for them through an appeal to or the existence of God. Thus, as Sartre said, everything is permissible. So within this world without morality, it doesn't really make sense to say whether Meursault is guilty or innocent except in perhaps simple ways that follow from the written law, but that are not objective, but are merely kind of constructed, and it all depends on what the law says that's written and codified in French Algeria in that case, or anywhere else. And terms like guilt and innocence don't objectively apply to anyone since they don't objectively exist. Within a framework like that, it would be harder to say whether Meursault should be called innocent or not, since the term is rather subjective and it depends on either feelings or a legal system, something like that, even though Sartre and others make the claim that Meursault should be seen as innocent because he's living by his own system of morality. That would be, he's innocent with respect to his own lack of moral system, but not with respect to others, as opposed to objectively innocent. So that's an angle you could approach it through a more philosophical but not necessarily absurdist or existentialist route. Now, another type of criticism that you could pull in is a psychological one. You could look at Meursault as a kind of psychological patient or case. Analyze how he reacts and what he does. For instance, he doesn't make decisions rationally all the time. He simply acts according to how things feel, often pursuing things that feel good or getting away from things that feel bad without thinking about them in any further capacity. Even the case of shooting the Arab on the beach, he can recall the sensory experiences that he underwent or felt at the time, but he cannot explain why he did that in any rational way or reasonable way with words and causation. Now, sociopathy and psychopathy, or psychopathy and sociopathy, however you want to pronounce it, weren't developed in the same way that they are now at the time of this book being written, and Camus may not have intended to try and present a psychological profile of a certain kind of pathology. However, there are a few things which you could point out that are interesting. While psychopaths and sociopaths don't experience empathy in the same way that most people do, they have difficulty with them, they aren't necessarily going to act like Meursault. They may be violent and act for simply whatever they feel good, they may be narcissistic, but they aren't necessarily going to do so, and they aren't necessarily going to be irrational. An interesting living example of someone who's a psychopath, but is also a very rational and religious person is David Wood. But there might be a case of someone you could look into and say, oh, well, this is a case of someone who does exhibit psychopathy or sociopathy and acts just like Meursault, where they don't explain their actions, where they only point to sensations and don't really rationalize it. You might look into cases like that, or other things than psychopathy, to try and understand Meursault's actions and how he feels things, whether it be you look into personality disorders or any other pathologies you might come across if you're interested in psychology. So, this was just a few things that I thought were worth pointing out and pulling out of the novel, especially in these two chapters to look at. If you liked any of them and want to pursue them further, that's great. Go into the book, read about them, find them, think about them, try and construct theories to understand them if you'd like. Perhaps you don't like any of them, but this will give you an idea of what to look for and how to think about literature. That's great too. If you really like Jean-Paul Sartre's and Camus' own interpretations, there's a link down below in the description to Sartre's essay or review, The Explication of the Stranger, that you can read if you're interested in that to see what he says. It will help you perhaps get an understanding of his own existentialist thought at the time, and as well as Camus, because he quotes Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus in it as well. Or if you want to research anything else like psychology or morality or colonial law and treatment of the native population by the French government, all those things you can research yourselves, and they may perhaps make your reading of the novel more fruitful or interesting.